He had everything: the looks, the charisma, the body, the wrestling ability. He had the one thing you cannot teach, the one thing that money cannot buy and training cannot manufacture. He had it. That indefinable quality that separates a good hand from a genuine star, the thing that made grown men in the front office lean forward in their chairs and whisper to each other that this kid, this one right here, was going to be the guy. Not a guy. The guy. The face of the entire industry for the next 15 years. And then, on a rainy night in October, on a road he had driven 1,000 times before, 2 miles from his own front door, it all ended in the space of a single heartbeat. This is the story of the greatest what-if in the history of professional wrestling. The story of a man who was days away from being crowned the biggest star in the business, only to have it stripped from him, not by a rival, not by a betrayal, not by politics or bad booking, but by the cruel randomness of a wet stretch of asphalt and a telephone pole. His name was Terry Allen, but the world knew him as Magnum TA. In this video, we trace his journey from a Virginia wrestling mat to the brink of immortality, from the brutal cage match that changed wrestling forever, to the night he struck the NWA president and surrendered his title to defend his mother's honor, and finally to Sardis Road on October 14, 1986, when wrestling lost the man destined to inherit it. And by the time we reach the end, you are going to understand why, nearly 40 years later, veterans of the business still talk about Terry Wayne Allen with a catch in their throats. Why they still say, without hesitation, that no one, not Hulk Hogan, not Ric Flair, not anyone, had a brighter future than the man whose career was stolen from him before it ever truly began. But to understand what was lost, you first have to understand what he was. So let's go back to the beginning. Terry Wayne Allen was born on June 11, 1959, in Chesapeake, Virginia. From an early age, it was obvious he was built differently than the other kids. He was an athlete, a natural, the kind of young man who seemed to excel at whatever physical challenge was placed in front of him. He attended Norfolk Collegiate School, and it was there, on the amateur wrestling mats, that the first hints of what he might become started to show. He joined the collegiate wrestling team, and he did not just participate. He won a state championship in the 167-pound division. He learned how to move. He learned how to grapple. He learned the discipline and the pain tolerance that amateur wrestling demands of everyone who steps onto the mat. After high school, he went on to Old Dominion University. He was a good-looking, well-built young man with an athletic background and a certain magnetism that people noticed the moment he walked into a room. He could have gone in a dozen different directions with his life, but something about the world of professional wrestling called to him. The spectacle of it, the drama, the idea of performing in front of thousands of screaming fans, of telling a story with your body, of becoming a hero. And so, in the early 1980s, Terry Allen decided to become a professional wrestler. He broke into the business the way everyone did back then, by paying his dues in the territory system. This was a different era of wrestling, a time before one company swallowed the entire industry, when the country was divided into regional promotions, each with its own champions and its own stars and its own loyal audience. If you wanted to make it, you traveled. You worked the small towns. You learned your craft in front of crowds who had seen it all and would let you know immediately if you were not up to standard. Allen started out in the National Wrestling Alliance, working for Championship Wrestling from Florida and for Pacific Northwest Wrestling out in Portland, Oregon. In Florida, he began to find his footing, and he found it first as a tag team wrestler. He captured the Global Tag Team Championship on 5 different occasions, 3 of those with a partner named Scott McGee, and 1 memorable run alongside a man who would become one of the most important figures in his entire life, the American Dream, Dusty Rhodes. The bond he formed with Rhodes in those early days would echo through the rest of his career and, indeed, through the rest of his life. But we will get to that. He was learning, he was improving. But he did not yet have the thing that would make him a household name. He did not yet have the character. That would come when he moved on to Mid-South Wrestling, the tough, hard-hitting territory run by Bill Watts, where wrestling was presented as close to a real fight as the business would allow. Now, here is where the legend truly begins to take shape. Terry Allen bore a striking resemblance to a certain television actor who, at that exact moment in the early 1980s, happened to be one of the biggest stars in America. That actor was Tom Selleck, and his show, Magnum T.A, was a cultural phenomenon. The mustache, the tanned, athletic build, the easy charm. Allen had all of it. And according to the story that has been told for decades, it was none other than Andre the Giant himself who looked at this young man and suggested the idea that would define him. Take the name Magnum from the hit show and combine it with your own initials, T for Terry, A for Allen. Magnum. It was perfect. It was instantly memorable. It evoked one of the coolest characters on television, and it fit him like a glove. The character was billed as the American heartthrob. And that was not just marketing. Female fans genuinely lost their minds for him. He was, without exaggeration, one of the best-looking men the wrestling business had ever seen. But here is the part that so many pretty boy wrestlers throughout history have failed to grasp. Magnum could actually go. The looks were the packaging. Underneath it was a legitimate athlete with an amateur wrestling background and a genuine feel for the emotional rhythms of a professional match. He was not a male model pretending to be a wrestler. He was a wrestler who happened to look like a male model. And that combination was lightning in a bottle. In Mid-South, he captured his first major singles title, the North American Heavyweight Championship, defeating the veteran Mr. Wrestling 2 on May 13, 1984. He held that belt for 5 months, defending it night after night, sharpening his skills, before finally dropping it to the massive Ernie Ladd, the Big Cat, that October. He was no longer a prospect. He was a proven commodity. And the biggest promotion in the National Wrestling Alliance had taken notice. In 1984, Jim Crockett Promotions signed Magnum. This was the big time. Jim Crockett Promotions was the flagship of the NWA, the home of the World Heavyweight Championship, the promotion that ran the Mid-Atlantic region and beamed its television across the country. This was where legends were made. Ric Flair was there, Dusty Rhodes was there, the Road Warriors, the Rock and Roll Express, the Koloffs. The entire constellation of 1980s wrestling stardom was gathered under that one banner, and Magnum walked in and immediately looked like he belonged at the very top of it. Their battles were stiff and physical, and out of that rivalry, on March 23, 1985, Magnum defeated Wahoo McDaniel to capture the United States Heavyweight Championship. The United States title in the NWA was not some mid-card trinket. It was the second most prestigious championship in the entire company, one rung below the world title itself, and historically it was the belt you held right before they made you the world champion. Ric Flair had held it, so had a long list of legends. Now it was around the waist of Magnum. That summer, at the very first Great American, the company was building around him. Everything was pointing in one direction. The office had made a decision, and it was the kind of decision that changes the course of wrestling history. Magnum was going to be the next NWA World Heavyweight Champion. He was being groomed for the throne. The plan was in motion. But before you ascend to the top of the mountain, you have to prove you can survive the climb. And that meant war with the most dangerous faction in the sport. The Four Horsemen: Ric Flair, Arn Anderson, Ole Anderson, and the man who would become Magnum's ultimate rival, the arrogant, sadistic, silver spoon villain Tully Blanchard, accompanied by his glamorous and treacherous valet, Baby Doll. Magnum against the Horsemen was a collision of everything the fans loved against everything they hated. The handsome, humble, working-class hero against the rich, cheating, cowardly aristocrats. And at the center of it, the feud narrowed to a single, white-hot rivalry: Magnum versus Tully. These two men genuinely could not stand each other, at least as far as the audience was concerned, and they told that story with a level of intensity that few rivalries in wrestling history have ever matched. On July 21, 1985, Blanchard did the unthinkable and defeated Magnum for the United States Championship. The hero had been beaten by the villain. The fans were desperate for revenge. And to prove just how ready he was for the world title picture, Magnum was given a shot at the biggest prize of all. On September 28th, he faced Ric Flair, the Nature Boy himself, for the NWA World Heavyweight Championship. They went nearly 30 minutes. 30 minutes of near falls and drama, with the whole building on its feet, believing that at any second they might witness a new champion crowned. Flair retained, but Magnum had proven he could hang for half an hour with the greatest world champion of the era and make it look like a coin flip. There was no doubt now. He was ready. Which brings us to the match. The one they still talk about. The match that did not just define Magnum's career, it invented an entire concept that wrestling has used ever since. Starrcade, 1985. The Gathering. The Greensboro Coliseum. Magnum challenging Tully Blanchard for the United States Championship. But this was not going to be a normal wrestling match. The hatred had gone too far for that. This would be settled inside a steel cage, and it would be the first ever I Quit match in the history of professional wrestling. There were no pinfalls. There was no countout. There was no escaping the cage. The only way to win was to make the other man take the microphone and scream the two words no proud man ever wants to say: I quit. What followed was, by the standards of its time and arguably by the standards of any time, one of the most savage, bloody, and emotionally raw contests ever committed to film. This was not choreographed wrestling. This was a fight. The two men clawed at each other's eyes. They smashed each other with the microphone. They raked each other's faces across the steel mesh of the cage until the blood flowed freely. At one point, Magnum drove Blanchard's arm into the cage and tore it open. And the sight of the blood seemed to send him into a frenzy, punching and biting at the wound like a wild animal. The screams of agony coming from both men, amplified by the microphone that was the entire point of the match, took the whole thing to a level that felt genuinely dangerous. And then came the finish that no one who saw it has ever forgotten. Baby Doll slid a wooden chair into the cage. Blanchard seized it, and he broke off a leg to create a jagged wooden spike, and he tried to drive it straight through Magnum's eye. The two men fought over the weapon, this improvised dagger, both of them knowing that whoever lost that struggle might lose an eye for real. And Magnum won it. He turned the spike around, and he jammed the broken, splintered point into Tully Blanchard's forehead, right above the eye, and he ground it into the flesh until Blanchard, the arrogant horseman who never backed down from anything, shrieked the word that ended it. Yes, he quit. Magnum was once again the United States champion, and he had won it in the single most visceral, unforgettable manner imaginable. That match has been rated 5 stars. It has been called one of the greatest grudge matches in the history of the business. It established the I Quit stipulation that promotions still use to this day, and every single one of the hundreds of I Quit matches that have taken place since, in every company around the world, traces its lineage back to that one bloody night in Greensboro, and it stands as the towering artistic peak of Magnum's career, the moment where a great wrestler became an icon. What made it so unforgettable was not the violence for its own sake, but the sheer conviction of it. The fans did not watch two performers executing a routine. They watched two men who appeared to genuinely hate each other, trying to maim one another inside a steel cage. There was a real sense of danger, a feeling that at any moment something could go horribly wrong, and that feeling is almost impossible to manufacture. Magnum manufactured it. He was 26 years old, he held the second most important title in the company, and he was being lined up to become the world champion. There was nowhere to go but the very top. But wrestling, like life, has a way of throwing obstacles in front of you right when you can taste your destiny. And the next obstacle came in the form of a 280-pound Russian wrecking machine named Nikita Koloff. In the spring of 1986, Ivan Koloff, the Russian Bear, began proclaiming that his nephew Nikita was destined to take the United States Championship away from the all-American hero. Nikita Koloff was terrifying. Bald, muscular, painted as a genuine Soviet monster at the absolute height of Cold War tensions, he was the perfect foil for the flag-waving Magnum Jim Crockett, arranged a formal contract signing to make a title match official. And what happened at that signing became one of the most memorable angles of the entire decade. Magnum, in a touching gesture, brought his own mother, Marion, to the contract signing to share in the moment. Nikita brought his uncle, Ivan. And then, in an act of pure villainy, designed to make every fan in America hate him, Nikita insulted Magnum's mother to her face. That was it. That was the line. Magnum exploded and a brawl erupted right there at the table. In the aftermath, the president of the National Wrestling Alliance, Bob Geigel, stepped in to publicly reprimand Magnum for what he called conduct unbecoming a champion, and Magnum's response has become the stuff of legend. He looked at the NWA president, he told him to reprimand this, and he punched him square in the face. For a wrestler to strike the president of the entire governing body was an act of near unthinkable defiance. And it came with a price. Magnum was stripped of the United States Championship. The title was placed up for grabs in a best-of-7 series against Nikita Koloff, a marathon war between the American hero and the Russian monster to decide who would own the second most important prize in the sport. It was an epic. Nikita jumped out to a commanding 3-0 lead, and it looked like the unthinkable was about to happen, that the Soviet villain was going to conquer the American heartthrob. But Magnum, refusing to quit, clawed his way back. He won the 4th match, then the 5th, then the 6th. 3 victories in a row to even the series at 3 matches apiece and force a winner-take-all 7th and final match. On August 17, 1986, in Charlotte, North Carolina, the 2 men fought the decider. And with cheating interference from Ivan Koloff and the villainous Crusher Khrushchev, Nikita Koloff stole the 7th match and captured the United States Championship. But here is the thing. The loss was only temporary, and everyone in the business knew it. The plan was still in place. Magnum was scheduled to win the United States title back for a 3rd time, and from there the company was going to put the World Heavyweight Championship around his waist. The pieces were all arranged. The coronation was coming. He was 27 years old, at the absolute peak of his powers, and the most important title in professional wrestling was, by every account, weeks away from being his. All he had to do was keep doing what he was doing. Keep showing up, keep being Magnum. And then came October 14th, 1986. It had been raining hard that day in Charlotte, North Carolina. A heavy, relentless rain that left standing water pooling across the roads. Terry Allen climbed into his Porsche and set out for home, driving along Sardis Road, a route he knew intimately, a route he had traveled countless times. His house was close, just a couple of miles away. He was almost there. And then the car hydroplaned. On the wet, flooded pavement, the tires lost their grip on the road, and in an instant, Terry Allen lost control of the vehicle. The Porsche slid, and it left the road, and it struck a telephone pole. The impact was catastrophic. In the years since, an unfortunate myth has attached itself to the story, a belief that he must have been speeding, that recklessness was to blame. But that is not what happened. Forensic investigators who examined the scene determined that Terry Allen had been driving at the speed limit. This was not carelessness. This was a hydroplane on a rain-soaked road, one of those cruel accidents that can happen to anyone at any time on any wet night. And then came the part that is almost too painful to contemplate. Terry Allen was trapped in the wreckage of his car, grievously injured, and no one knew. He lay there pinned in the twisted metal for roughly 2 hours before a passing witness finally spotted the wreck and called for help. 2 hours. On the side of a road, 2 miles from his own home, with injuries that would have killed most men outright. The damage was devastating. The force of the impact caused the C4 and C5 vertebrae in his neck to, in the words used by those who described it, explode. His neck was broken. Doctors at Carolina's medical center went to work trying to save his life, and they would later say, plainly, that the only reason Terry Allen survived at all was his extraordinary physical conditioning. The years of training, the amateur wrestling, the dedication to his body, all of it combined to keep him alive on a night when a lesser-conditioned man would simply have died. But survival came at a terrible cost. The right side of his body was paralyzed. For months, it was genuinely doubted whether Terry Allen would ever walk again, and even the most optimistic doctors could not promise him the future he had lost. He would have to relearn how to move, how to control a body that had once been a finely tuned athletic machine and was now, in an instant, a stranger to him. And whatever the outcome of his long recovery, one thing was certain from almost the very beginning. The wrestling career of Magnum was over, The man who was days away from the World Heavyweight Championship would never wrestle another match. At 27 years old, at the exact peak of his abilities, with the biggest prize in the sport almost within his grasp, it was gone. All of it. Gone in the time it takes a car to slide off a wet road. The reaction across the wrestling world was one of shock and grief. Fans from all over the country flooded the hospital with phone calls, desperate for any update on his condition, refusing to believe that their hero could really be lying broken in a hospital bed. Wrestlers came to visit him too, but this was still the era of kayfabe, the era when the illusion of wrestling had to be protected at all costs, and that created a strange and heartbreaking problem. Magnum was a beloved good guy. If a villain was seen visiting him at his bedside, it would shatter the illusion that these men were bitter enemies. And so, according to the stories that have been passed down, Ric Flair, the arch-villain, the Nature Boy, the man who Magnum had chased for the world title, cared so deeply about his fallen colleague that he bundled himself up in disguise, hiding his famous face, just so he could sneak in to visit Magnum in the hospital without breaking character in front of the public. Behind the scenes, the men who portrayed enemies on television were, in that hospital, simply grieving friends. Now the company faced a crisis. Magnum had been the centerpiece of their entire future, and overnight that future had evaporated. The man he had been feuding with, the Russian monster Nikita Koloff, was suddenly a villain without his hero, and in one of the most emotionally resonant creative decisions in wrestling history, Dusty Rhodes, who was booking the promotion, made the choice to transform Nikita Koloff from hated enemy into beloved ally. The storyline was simple and devastatingly effective. Through their brutal war over the United States Championship, Nikita had come to respect Magnum. And now, with Magnum unable to carry the torch, Nikita would carry it for him. The Russian villain became an American hero, and the transformation was memorialized in a wrestling magazine of the era with an image of Nikita Koloff beside the haunting words, "I cry for Magnum." It was one of the great character turns of the decade, born entirely out of real-life tragedy. But the story of Terry Allen does not end in that hospital bed, because what he did next revealed something about his character that all the titles and all the great matches never could. He fought through a recovery that doctors had warned might never allow him to walk again, and he refused to disappear. His first appearance back on television came in an interview segment, where a still-recovering Magnum spoke to the fans who had prayed for him. And then came the moment that brought an entire arena to tears. At the Crockett Cup in 1987, with the aid of a cane and supported by 2 referees on either side of him, Magnum slowly, painstakingly walked to ringside. He was there to embrace his best friend Dusty Rhodes and his former enemy-turned-brother Nikita Koloff. To see the man who months earlier had been paralyzed in a hospital bed, standing at ringside under his own power, leaning on a cane, wrapping his arms around the men he loved, was one of the most emotional scenes wrestling had ever produced. It was not a championship celebration. It was something far more meaningful. It was a man refusing to let a broken neck break his spirit. Terry Allen would never wrestle again, but he refused to leave the business that he loved. He reinvented himself. He hosted an interview segment as a character called The Boss. He worked as a color commentator for the NWA, for the Universal Wrestling Federation, and later for World Championship Wrestling. His sharp mind for the psychology of the sport translating perfectly to the broadcast booth. He served as a manager, standing in the corner of his old friend Dusty Rhodes and his old rival Nikita Koloff. He found a way to stay, to contribute, to remain part of the fabric of the industry even after the industry had taken so much from him. In a business full of bitter men who never got over what could have been, Terry Allen carried himself with a grace and a lack of self-pity that impressed everyone who knew him. And here is one of the more remarkable twists in the entire story. Remember Tully Blanchard, the hated rival, the man whose forehead Magnum ground a wooden spike into at Starrcade? Years later, Terry Allen married a woman named Courtney Shattuck. Courtney was Tully Blanchard's former wife, and so Terry Allen, the man who had waged the bloodiest feud of the 1980s against Tully Blanchard, became the stepfather to Tully's daughter, Tessa Blanchard, who grew up to become an accomplished professional wrestler in her own right. The bitter enemies of Starrcade were now bound together by family. In wrestling, as in life, the lines between rivals and loved ones have a way of blurring over the decades. And there is one more thread that ties Magnum to the modern era in a way that would have seemed impossible back in 1986. His deep, lifelong friendship with Dusty Rhodes, the bond forged in those early Florida tag team days, endured for the rest of Dusty's life. And Terry Allen became the godfather to Dusty Rhodes' son. That son grew up to become one of the biggest stars in the wrestling world of today, a main event champion and a household name. His name is Cody Rhodes, so the next time you see Cody Rhodes headlining the grandest stage of them all, remember that standing quietly behind him, a part of his family, is the man who was supposed to be the biggest star of the 1980s, the godfather who never got his own crown. Over the years, the accolades came, small consolations for a career cut so cruelly short. Pro Wrestling Illustrated ranked him among the greatest singles wrestlers of the modern era. He received a Lou Thesz World Heavyweight Championship award in recognition of his amateur roots. And in 2020, Magnum was inducted into the Professional Wrestling Hall of Fame, a permanent acknowledgement of a legacy that, despite everything, refused to be forgotten. In 2024, decades after that rainy October night, he was spotted sitting in the crowd at a major wrestling event, honoring the retirement of another legend, sitting alongside his old brother, Nikita Koloff. The two men, who had fought a best-of-7 war for the United States title, still side by side after all these years. But the question that hangs over the entire story, the question that wrestling fans have debated for nearly 4 decades, is the one that can never be answered. What if? What if it had not rained that day? What if he had taken a different route home? What if he had left the arena 5 minutes earlier or 5 minutes later? Because everyone agrees, without exception, on what was about to happen. Magnum was going to be the NWA World Heavyweight Champion. He was going to be the face of the promotion. And in a world where wrestling was about to explode into the national mainstream, there is a compelling argument that Magnum, with his looks and his charisma and his ability, could have become one of the 2 or 3 biggest stars the entire industry ever produced. He had the combination that comes along maybe once in a generation. He might have been the man they built the future around. He might have been as big as anyone who ever lived. Instead, he became the greatest what-if of them all. The star who burned so bright and was extinguished so suddenly that his legend is defined not by what he accomplished, though he accomplished plenty, but by the impossible, tantalizing vision of everything he never got the chance to do. And yet, when you talk to the people who knew him, that is not the part they dwell on. They do not talk about the bitterness, because there was none. They talk about a man who was dealt one of the cruelest hands imaginable, and who responded not with anger, but with dignity. A man who fought his way out of a wheelchair and back onto his feet. A man who stayed in the business he loved even after it could no longer love him back the way it once had. A man who built a family, who became a godfather and a stepfather, who found a way to keep contributing, to keep smiling, to keep living a full and meaningful life long after the cheers of the arena had faded. Magnum never got to become world champion. He never received the coronation that seemed not only possible, but inevitable. He never got the final victory that would have confirmed what everyone already believed, that he was the man destined to carry the National Wrestling Alliance into a new era. But perhaps the real measure of Magnum is not found in the championship he never won. Maybe it is found in everything that came afterward, in the way he carried himself when the accident took away his career, his independence, and the future he had spent his entire life building. Maybe the true legacy of Terry Allen is not simply the greatest wrestling career that never happened, but the quiet, unbreakable strength of a man who lost his dream just 2 miles from home and refused, absolutely refused, to let that become the end of his story. The mustache, the charisma, the blood-soaked triumph at Starrcade, the punch heard around the wrestling world, the rain falling on Sardis Road, and then the long, dignified life that followed. A life defined not by bitterness, but by survival, resilience, and grace. That is the story of Magnum TA, the brightest star wrestling never got to see fully shine. If you enjoyed this deep dive into one of wrestling's most bittersweet legends, make sure you like this video and subscribe to the channel for more hard-hitting wrestling documentaries. Until next time.